Hello and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm Nora. Joining me in the studio today is Christopher Gunness, the founder and director of the Myanmar Accountability Project. Thank you for joining me, Chris.
It's my great pleasure.
You were a BBC reporter in Myanmar during the 1988 pro-democracy protests or 88 uprising. Can you share what that was like and how it compares to the 2021 anti-coup protests and uprising?
Well, it was an extraordinary time for me because I was just a young reporter and I went to Burma undercover. In those days, you couldn't get a visa to go and report as a journalist. So I got myself a tourist visa. I went underground. I stayed in the Strand Hotel, which in those days was nothing like the Strand Hotel in Rangoon, Yangon as it now is. And as soon as I got there, really, the students made it clear to me that they wanted to talk to me. I recorded interviews with them, and the interviews went out on the BBC. In those interviews, the students said, "Our revolution will begin at 8 on the 8th of the 8th of 1988. The interview was recorded in July the 22nd, and the interviews were broadcast. They were smuggled out in diplomatic bags, went to the BBC, were broadcast, and at 8 on the 8th of the 8th of 1988, the dock workers in Rangoon laid down their tools, they went out on strike, and the rest of the nation followed. Unfortunately, in September 1988, the army cruelly and brutally fired at crowds of unarmed demonstrators, and effectively the revolution came to an end. Now, today there are huge differences. One of the main differences is that Myanmar went through a transition. So basically between 2011 and 2020, November, when the elections were held, you saw this extraordinary flourishing of civil society. You saw political prisoners released and joining in the political mainstream. You saw the media being loosened up. You saw this huge exponential increase in the use of the internet. And I think one of the big differences between 1988 and now is that, as we say, the genie is out of the bottle. Myanmar has tasted a period of liberalism. Gen Z are light years ahead of the generals. I mean, that's the amazing thing. These young kids are able to wrong foot. They're able to organize online. They're able to communicate with the outside world. They're able to communicate with journalists. So, it's just a completely different world. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the many reasons why the revolution, and it is a revolution, has been as successful as it has, is partly because there's more cohesion, that both in terms of the movement amongst young people, but also the cohesion amongst the non-junta forces is just so much better coordinated. And I think the fact that we've got to the situation where the junta controls less than about a third, possibly less, of the country is a testament to that big difference. There is an internet, there is a method of coordination which simply didn't exist in 1988.
Your career took you to the Middle East for many years with the United Nations, but following the 2021 military coup, you founded the Myanmar Accountability Project. Can you explain why?
Yes, so when the coup happened, although we all sort of knew it was going to happen because Min Online basically said, "I'm going to stop this happening." I mean, it was clear that Aung San Suu Kyi had pushed the junta beyond the point which they were going to find acceptable. And although it was a predictable coup in some ways, we all sort of woke up that morning and just thought, "Oh my Lord, there's been a coup, what can we do?" And, the development folks were thinking, what can they do in terms of development? The emergency humanitarian response folks were doing that. And I got together with a group of lawyers and said, what doesn't exist in terms of accountability? And what didn't exist in terms of accountability was an organization exclusively dedicated to bringing criminal prosecutions against war criminals from Myanmar. And so basically I set up the Myanmar Accountability Project in order to go after the generals in national courts under the principle of universal jurisdiction, which effectively says it doesn't matter if the perpetrator is not a national of whichever jurisdiction you're in. It doesn't matter if the victim is not a national of that jurisdiction. It doesn't matter where the crime took place. under universal jurisdiction principles, cases can be brought in different jurisdictions. And so our lawyers went about finding different jurisdictions where we could bring cases. And today we have a case in the UK, we have a case in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Turkey, and I am talking to an amazing group of lawyers in Timor-Leste, where we will bring a case, we hope, at the end of this year. So we're concentrating on Southeast Asia, but we do have other cases. And in fact, one very good jurisdiction is France, because a court in France recently held a trial in absentia of some of the torturers who'd worked for the Assad regime in Syria. And what that essentially did was set a precedent whereby if we can find a dual French-Burmese national in France, we will be able to bring a case. So if there's anyone listening to this who knows of anyone who is Burmese from Myanmar in France who has French citizenship and who has a family member or who themselves have had an atrocity crime committed against them, please get in touch with me, because we can bring a case in France. There's been this trial in absentia, which led to a conviction. So 3 Assad torturers were convicted even though they weren't in France. So let us hope we can bring a case in France. That's what I'd like to do if possible. So as I say, if anyone's listening to this program who knows somebody in France who's a French citizen as well as possibly a Burmese citizen, though that's not important, doesn't matter if they're not in France, they just have to be a French citizen, please get in touch, because we will bring a case for them.
Why has no leader in Myanmar ever tried to pursue transitional justice or reconciliation for those who have faced crimes by the military?
I think if you're talking about the junta, they're frightened of justice. They know that they have committed atrocity crimes. They know that their soldiers have committed rape. They know that they've burnt down villages. They know that they're doing these airstrikes, which are a violation of international law. They know they're guilty. And they know that any transitional justice mechanism is likely to see themselves having the finger of guilt pointed at them. So, there's no question in my mind that the Myanmar junta will not submit to accountability. The only way to make this happen is to force them and to bring cases around the world. So as well as having cases in national jurisdictions, such as the ones I've outlined that the Myanmar Accountability Project, my organisation, is pursuing, there are also cases at the ICC and the ICJ, the International Criminal Court, which has just issued an arrest, or which is the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, has asked the pretrial chamber to issue an arrest warrant against Min Aung Hlaing for crimes committed against the Rohingya in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh has accepted the jurisdiction of the court. So the crime of deportation, which forced these people into Bangladesh, that is the crime that's being pursued there. But there's also the case that the Gambia have brought against the junta at the ICJ. So there are many different types of accountability. And let me say, in a very forthright way, I believe that 2025 will be the year of accountability in Myanmar. I would like to think that this year will be the year in which cases advance. And there are cases all around the world, and there are cases in international fora, the ICC and the ICJ, where I think we are going to see advances.
So when you look at this ICJ case now, do you think it's actually creating meaningful pressure on the military? What will real impact look like?
Well, what's important is that in July 2022, the court, the ICJ, rejected the arguments of the junta. The junta tried to say that the Gambia had no right to bring a case there. They had no standing, is the word that the court uses, and that's been rejected. And what's happening now is that substantive written cases are being drawn up, and those will eventually be heard. And although you have to understand that the ICJ is a court which adjudicates cases between states, so you won't see individual criminal responsibility, but you will see the further isolation. I believe the case I believe the case will be successful. The arguments against the junta are very, very powerful. And what that will mean, just as we're seeing in the case of Israel, is the further marginalization. And that's important because it's used diplomatically. In the United Nations, there's a struggle going on for recognition. The junta wants its credentials to be recognized. Well, if they are genocidal and if the UN's highest judicial organ has found them guilty of genocide, it will be that much harder for them to find international recognition. So, think of this as water dripping on a stone. It's very slow. It takes a long time. It's one of the many mechanisms we have. It's one of the many levers we can pull. So although you can be very critical of the ICJ, you can be very cynical, you can say justice delayed is justice denied, all these things. The fact is, it is one of many levers that must be pulled, which is being pulled, and which must be used to further isolate the junta.
How is the concept of universal jurisdiction being used to pursue justice for survivors of crimes committed by the Myanmar military?
Well, the most advanced case is brought by an extraordinary organisation called Brooke, the Burmese Rohingya organisation of the UK, headed up by an extraordinary man called Tun Kin. And they have brought a case in Argentina. They brought the case in 2019. The court in Buenos Aires rejected it, but then later in the year that was overturned. In 2021, the investigation, the case began, and in 2023, they took, with an organization called Legal Action Worldwide, an extraordinary organization led by a woman called Antonia Mulvey, they actually took victims to the court in Buenos Aires, and they were able to tell their truths, to talk about what happened to them. And this is a really important thing about universal jurisdiction. What it does is allow victims to tell their truths, to validate their narratives, and to become advocates of themselves, their families, their own communities, their own causes. And, we don't know what will happen in Argentina. I hope that they will issue arrest warrants for Min Aung Hlaing and others, and Interpol will arrest them and put them on trial. That's the wish list. But even if we don't get that far, what Brooke have done is given victims, people who never thought they would have access to justice, it's given them the opportunity to come and speak and to tell their truths, to validate their narratives. And that's also true of the cases which MAP, my organization, has done. We have a case in the Philippines. And what happened was victims were able to go to Manila. These are Chin people. The Philippines is an overwhelmingly Christian country, so we encouraged a Christian case, a case against the Christian community. A pastor was murdered, churches were attacked, faith-based organizations, schools, for example, churches are being attacked. And we took 5 victims, Chin victims, to Manila, and we filed the complaint at the prosecutor's office, and then we went to a hotel next door, and they gave an extraordinary press conference. There were dozens of journalists, many cameras, and the Chin people stood up and they told the world what was happening in Chin State, the appalling attack on Phant Lang in October 2021, where the town was burnt down, where first responders who went to help, who went to take medicine, they were shot at and killed in some cases, bodies mutilated. So, universal jurisdiction is about trying to bring the perpetrators to justice, but it's also about giving victims the chance to tell their stories. And certainly MAP, my organization, puts victims front and center. It's about allowing people who never thought they'd have access to justice to come and to tell their truths.
About the case in Philippines court, is there any updates on this?
Yes, what happened is that the prosecutor actually violated their own terms of reference by refusing even to accept our case. They wouldn't even give us a docket number. So we have moved to appeal, and we filed, or we're about to file, a motion to reconsider, and we will appeal this all the way up to the Supreme Court in the Philippines. On the way, we appeal to the executive, so the Justice Department, the President's Office, and then it goes to the Appeals Court and the Supreme Court. So, it's not over till it's over. And along the way, our complainants, the victims of these atrocity crimes, will have the chance to tell the world what happened to them. It'll be an opportunity to discredit the junta and to bring pressures within Southeast Asia, within the ASEAN region, against the junta. So that case is very much open and active in the Philippines, and we will pursue it. But we also have a case in Indonesia. And as I say, we're also pursuing justice for victims in Myanmar, in Timor-Leste.
How important are cases like this filed in national courts to the bigger picture of justice in Myanmar?
They're extremely important because they are another avenue. So you've got the case in the ICC where we hope there will be an arrest warrant for Min Aung Hlaing. You have the case in the ICJ, which we hope will find that Myanmar has violated the Genocide Convention. And then we have cases, as I said, in Argentina. We have our case in the Philippines, in Indonesia, and also Timor-Leste. So big picture, there is an accountability network, an ecosystem of accountability that's growing up around the world. And it means that increasingly, whatever the result, victims will have more and more chance to tell their stories, and the junta will increasingly become isolated and marginalized. And that can only be a good thing. While inside Myanmar, the revolution is gaining territory, it's gaining credibility. Outside Myanmar, accountability is an extremely important mechanism for, in a way, supporting and complementing what's happening inside Myanmar itself.
As you mentioned earlier, MAP is working on other cases being brought against the Myanmar military regime in other countries. So without getting into specifics, are you finding that more countries are willing to take on these cases? What approaches seem to work best?
So what we do in MAP is to find jurisdictions where the possibility exists. So, for example, a very good example is Indonesia. Indonesia has promulgated a new penal code, and the new penal code will come into force in January 2026. And the new penal code in Indonesia specifically allows universal jurisdiction. Now, I don't want to say too much about what we're going to do, but that opens the door for universal jurisdiction cases relating to Myanmar to be heard in Indonesia. So our approach is to look at jurisdictions. We concentrate on East Asia because the Security Council in Resolution 2669 and the General Assembly all say we need regional solutions for regional problems. And Myanmar is seen in the UN system as a regional problem which must be resolved by ASEAN. Now, we all know that the ASEAN 5-point consensus is pretty much dead in the water and is leading nowhere. Nonetheless, there are opportunities for accountability in Southeast Asia, and we are pursuing them. If at the end of the day, and it may take years, we've got nowhere, we will go back to the United Nations and we will say, you told us to find solutions in Southeast Asia. We've done everything we can to do that. And look what's happened. But we're not there yet. I'm hopeful that there will be progress in our case in the Philippines, which, as I say, is very much an active and open battle that we're forging there, we're fighting there. I hope that there will be progress in Indonesia. I hope that we will be able to open a case in Timor-Leste, which we're planning to do perhaps in October next year. And so, yeah, I think that we can't be pessimistic. I say this in relation to Palestinians. I do a lot of work on Gaza. We don't have the luxury of pessimism. We can't give up. We have to carry on fighting the fight for justice and accountability. And that's certainly what MAP will continue to do.
Yeah. About the ICC's Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan's request to arrest warrant for Min Aung Hlaing in November, do you think if this arrest warrant is issued, that this will lead to any change?
I certainly think the Myanmar military are very aware that they are being watched. Now, does that mean that these indiscriminate and disproportionate aerial strikes on internally displaced people, on innocent women and children, do I think they'll stop? No. Sadly, I think that the more that the forces opposing the junta win on the battlefield, the more you're seeing these desperate indiscriminate attacks. But I do think that there will be some in the army, and I don't know who they are, but I'm sure that there are some in the army who are intelligent human beings who will see themselves being accused of war crimes. I mean, we listed 23 members of the junta in our case in Turkey. They know who they are, their wives know who they are, their children know who they are. I think ultimately these, as I say, it's water dripping on a stone. It's a lever that has to be pulled. I think that it'll be interesting, when the army does eventually give way and allows democracy to return to Myanmar. And I have no doubt that that day will come. There's no doubt in my mind that the army will have to step aside. What that means in practice, I don't know. But I think that this accountability work and the accusations against specific members of the military in Myanmar for specific crimes, the perpetrators know exactly who they are. And I would like to think that that will at least have some resonance within the army. I don't believe that the Myanmar army is entirely evil. I think there are a lot of very evil people in it, including Min Aung Hlaing. I think there are many generals who are instructing their troops to commit war crimes. At the same time, I think that there have to be some people of conscience who will think, I don't want to do that. I don't want to obey this command to commit crimes against my own people. We've seen that in other countries. Look at Israel. You've seen members of the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli army. You've seen pilots. You've seen all sorts of people come out on the streets in Israel, in cities across Israel, saying, we don't want to commit war crimes and genocide in Gaza. And I think, if you were able to allow protests in Myanmar today, I think undoubtedly there'd be members of the armed forces on the streets because they want to change the army, maybe as a pragmatic move to try and keep the army in power. But I've no doubt that there are people within the Myanmar army who look at what's happening and cannot live with their consciences. That's why we're seeing one of many reasons why we're seeing the number of defectors go up. Yes, they're being defeated on the battlefield, but I think morale in the military in Myanmar has never, ever been so low. And these criminal litigations against these people does have an impact.
There have been accusations against resistant groups for committing war crimes. The Arakan Army even admitted to executing 2 Myanmar military personnel last week. How can these groups be held accountable?
Well, they can be held accountable in exactly the same way that Min Aung Hlaing is being held accountable. So if groups want to, they can bring cases around the world against the Arakan Army under the principle of universal jurisdiction. But can I say publicly and for the record, the Myanmar Accountability Project, MAP, has limited resources. So we don't have enough money to bring cases all around the world for everything. In an ideal world, we could. I would employ an army of lawyers and we'd pursue, crimes all over in all jurisdictions in the world. But we don't have that, with those resources, and we don't have that luxury. So for the time being, I have taken the strategic decision within the Myanmar Accountability Project to go after members of the junta. There are plenty of war crimes that they are committing, and they've been committing them for years and years and years before anyone started accusing the Arakan Army of committing crimes and crimes against humanity. So we in MAP at least have made the strategic decision with the full understanding of our donors that we are going after the junta for the time being, and that is our decision to pursue members of the junta for the time being.
So what are the next steps to pursue justice and accountability in Myanmar?
For the Myanmar Accountability Project, the answer is we are opening cases in Timor-Leste. We will continue to pursue justice in the Philippines and Indonesia. And as I say, there's a really good opportunity to open a case in France if we can find a Burmese person with French nationality. And then you have the case at the ICC. I hope and I pray that an arrest warrant will be issued for Min Aung Hlaing, that Interpol will put out an arrest warrant, and that he will be arrested. Otherwise, he'll have to stay in Myanmar like an indicted war criminal. So, there will be no international recognition for him. He will be the hunted man that he is. He is an accused war criminal. He's a hunted war criminal. He's wanted by international justice. And I would like to think that, does the Myanmar army, which sees itself as the proud savior of the nation, going back to General Aung San, the army has always claimed to be the force that will hold the country together, the great savior of the nation. Well, we all know that's not true. But the fact that Min Aung Hlaing, the head of the army, the head of the coup, will have an arrest warrant over his head, that's proof positive of exactly how marginalized, how illegitimate, and how unacceptable to the people of Myanmar this man is. And I hope it mean that he was unacceptable even to the army itself. No army wants to be led by a wanted war criminal.
A documentary film made by the UK independent newspaper called Cancelled, The Rise and Fall of Aung San Suu Kyi, was released in December. It has led to renewed calls for her release from prison in Naypyidaw. Why do you think the regime has kept her isolated since the 2021 coup?
There will be overwhelming public support for the return of democracy and for the army to be sent back to its barracks. I think they're terrified of her. I think they're worried about what she represents. And I'd like to think that while she was in prison, the National Unity Government, the NLD, her party, would have maybe learned some lessons, that there's a lot of ill feeling amongst the ethnic nationalities, amongst the Rohingya, for example, about the fact that she did go to The Hague. There's a big debate, including in that film you mentioned, about the extent to which she defended the generals. I think there are a lot of questions about whether she did or she didn't. And I think that the assumption that she was guilty of, backing the genocide, I think that's being questioned. But I think, wherever one stands on that issue, I think that there is now a really big opportunity for the National Unity Government to embrace the ethnic nationalities and to show that they are implacably opposed to the 1982 citizenship law, that they will have that thrown out, completely rewritten, and that the ethnic nationalities in Myanmar can trust the NUG, because I think at the moment there's huge distrust because, in part, Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague and made that appearance that she made. I personally think that was extremely ill-advised. I think that was a huge strategic blunder. I don't think she should have done that. Nonetheless, I think that she has a huge opportunity to show to the ethnic nationalities that she was elected by all the people in Myanmar, that she will represent all the people of Myanmar. And I think that the NUG, the NLD, needs to make that much, much clearer. And I think they have to take very, very robust action to deal with the 1982 Citizenship Act, which is clearly, it needs to be scrapped and something which is completely inclusive put in its place.
So before we wrap up, is there anything you would like to say to the Myanmar people?
I mean, don't lose hope. I can imagine the pain. I can imagine the agony. I can imagine the rage and the anger at the injustice and these appalling crimes. The illegitimate junta is committing these atrocity crimes on a daily basis. And I think I want to say the outside world is with you and that we are doing everything we can to support your revolution. I wish the UN inside Myanmar would do more. I wish that they would be much more open to working with the National Unity government. They seem to be frightened of that for some reason. They're worried about visas being denied, these tiny bureaucratic issues compared with the big picture. So I suppose my message is don't lose hope. 2025 will be the year of accountability. We're working to bring the generals to justice. And we're working to make sure that your revolution will succeed in all the different ways that it must succeed. And as many people have said, the wheel of the arc of history bends in the direction of justice. There is no doubt in my mind that the people of Myanmar will live in dignity. They will live in freedom. They will live free from fear. It's really only a matter of time. before we get there. I think that even if the army went, there'd be a period of real chaos and confusion, but we have to work through that, and we have to make sure that the people of Myanmar emerge on the other side of this and are able to live free from fear in dignity, where the humanity and the dignity of every single individual person in Myanmar is nurtured, is respected, so that the country can thrive.
Thank you for your time and expertise on these issues, Chris.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.